A little while ago, I tried making a rocket using every engine in Kerbal Space Program, and during that challenge, I visited a handful of moons. I've been thinking though, and I want to take that to the extreme and visit every moon with one Kerbal. Starting out in the vehicle assembly building, the first thing I wanted to do was focus on the main lander, and for that, you can see I put down a command pod, I put down some fuel tanks, and on those, I put down a couple of engines. Now, with all that done, the next thing I wanted to do here is put down some landing gear, and also put down some lights. And with all those basic things done, the next thing I wanted to do was worry about how to get this docked. So starting out here, put down a docking port, and also put down a monopropellant tank and some RCS thrusters. These will let me guide myself around in the air and get myself to maneuver to where I need to go. With all that done, you can see I put down a couple of solar panels, and after that, I also snuck in one more fuel tank just in case I was gonna need it. Now, I'm also putting down another fuel tank off to the side here, and this is for another lander. Now, my plan was to have a big lander to land on all the big moons, but for the ones that are really light, I didn't really need anything that powerful, so I figured what I could do here is to make a really lightweight lander with just a small command seat on top. I ended up encapsulating the entire thing in a fairing, and with all that done, it's time to worry about the main ship. Now, for this, you can see here, I put down some large fuel tanks in the bottom, and this is gonna be so that once I dock, I'm able to refuel and get to the next moon. Now, the liquid fuel is actually not that efficient for getting around though, so what I wanted to do here is add on some xenon tanks, and you can see after making a huge chain of these, I wanted to put down some ion engines at the bottom of those. And to power those, I was gonna need some solar panels. Now, I just started completely covering the surface of this in solar panels, and I figured that this should do the job. Once I added all those on here though, the lag was starting to get unreal. Every time I tried to move something here, and you can see once I doubled up these engines, it just really got bad, and trying to load back in here, you can see it's so slow. So what I actually wanted to do is just slightly modify the design here to make it a little bit more bearable. This, for whatever reason, ended up being a lot more stable, and you can see I ended up shooting myself up into orbit here just to test out a few things. And once I extended out those solar panels, I was able to burn the engines and actually get some thrust going. So with the main ship finally looking good, what I wanted to do now is actually just test out the top ship, and you can see I removed the entire bottom portion for this. Now, to test this out, what I wanted to do is actually go to Lathe here, and this is going to be one of the moons I need to land on. Now, Lathe is actually pretty similar to Kerbin here, but it's a little bit later, and the atmosphere is a little bit thinner. So after killing my orbit here, I started to fall into the atmosphere, and what I wanted to do was mostly use the atmosphere to brake. This was going to save me a lot of fuel, but I did need to verify that I wasn't going to actually explode if I did this. Fortunately here though, my speed slowly seemed to chip away, and I started to fall further and further in. Now, I didn't manage to land on land, but that was actually okay for now. All I wanted to do was verify that I could produce some thrust once I'm at sea level, so I'm actually able to get to an orbit. You can see here my parachute's starting to kick in. Once I was going slow enough, I did want to cut them so I could go straight up into the air. And at first, this didn't really seem to work. I cut them a little bit too late, and I did start to turn, but at the very least, it seemed like I was actually gaining some height for a small bit of time there. Now, I added on a couple more parachutes just to slow me down a bit more. After I did that, I ended up cutting all the parachutes at once and trying to launch into the air. Now, I was managing to go up, but it was really slow. The speed I was gaining just was not great, and my thrust to weight ratio was kinda garbage. Also, I could see I was starting to turn in the atmosphere, and I could definitely use some fins. So I deleted off the engines I had and replaced it with a more powerful one, and after I did that, I also added in some drills. This is so I can mine once I get to the surface and replenish all of my fuel to hopefully get into orbit here. So after the drills, I also need to add in one of these convertitrons, and with that, I also added on some radiators and also some of these power cells just to give me a bit of energy so that I'm able to mine at night. But after that, it seemed like everything was good to go here, and I wanted to try going for the launch. Now, to get up into orbit, my plan was to stack a ton of these huge engines, and I figured if I just stacked a bunch of rings of these, I should be able to get into orbit pretty easily. The game didn't really seem to love this, so what I wanted to do instead was try launching immediately and not giving it a chance to freak out. This at first appeared to be better, but the lag was still unreal, and also after a while, you can see that my rockets were just sort of flying off and not really working. So what I wanted to do here is actually delete my big fuel tank and replace it with a much smaller one. This saves me a ton of weight here, and you can see I got rid of an entire ring of boosters. Now, the lag was still pretty bad here, but I was able to launch off the launch pad, and overall, this seemed to be a lot better. So starting out the full mission here, you can see I'm burning up into the air, and I only started to turn once I shaved off my first set of boosters. This was mainly because I was worried that if I started to turn a bit too early, the boosters would fall down into the rocket and cause it to explode. And after those boosters finally ran out of fuel here, you can see I ended up detaching them and starting off my ion engines. Now, I was trying to pull away just a little little bit from these boosters, and that's so I could extend out my solar panels. You also see here I ended up getting rid of that fairing, and once I did that, I extended out my solar panels and started to extend out my orbit even more. Now, I technically don't have an orbit yet here, and that's why I needed to keep burning in order to get that. And you can see after just a little while, I finally got my periapsis, and after a little while past that, I got it above 70,000 meters, which means I have a stable orbit. And with that achieved, the first target I wanted to go for was the moon. This is the closest moon to Kerbin, and it just seemed like a natural first target. Now, in order to get there, you can see I just kept burning my ion engines here and extending out my orbit even more. This was a really long process, and it just took a long time of going around and around Kerbin, extending out my orbit a bit more each time, but finally I got to 10 million meters, and I was actually a little bit short of the moon's orbit. That was intentional here, and you can see once I did that, what I actually decided to do here is pull in my solar panels, and I wanted to launch off my main lander. I do have a small issue though, and it's that I have those side landers still attached to the main lander. I wanted to move them back onto the main ship because I didn't really want to lug them around. So to deal with that here, you can see I ended up sending my Kerbal away, and I sent them over to the first small lander. And you can see here, after getting them in that lander, I ended up maneuvering them around just to get around to that docking port, and once they ended up clipping on here, I ended up going to the other lander and doing the exact same thing. Now with that done, got back into the main ship, and it was time to finally go for the landing. So I ended up decoupling from the main ship, and after that, I sent off the decoupler on the bottom, and I started to burn away. Now since I was so close to the moon already, it only took a tiny bit of fuel to finally get all the way there, and once I had that, I ended up tuning it so I'd be just over the moon's surface. I didn't want to run directly into it, but I did want to be pretty close here, and you can see now warping in close to the moon. And you can see now, once I got around to the periapsis, I started to burn here and actually kill my orbit entirely so I'd run right into the moon. Now once I had that, it was time to go for the landing here, and my plan was actually not to mine on the surface of the moon because I figured I should be able to get away with not doing that. But you can see the moon's surface getting a lot closer now, and I actually did mess up at the one point and bounce up a little bit too high, but after not too long, it did land on the surface, and it wasn't actually that flat. I figured it shouldn't be too big of a deal though, because it's only off by about 5 degrees, but my rocket still turned over. That was concerning, so if I couldn't even land on something that shallow, I was gonna have a lot of problems on the other moons. Fortunately though, I ended up setting the spring strength of all the landing legs to be a lot stronger, and you can see now landing gear is a lot stiffer. Unfortunately though, this surface was a lot less flat, and it was really hard to land on. Now, one more landing attempt here though, and I did actually land on flat ground, and with that done, it was time to plant the first of 9 flags. Now again, I don't really want to mine on the moon's surface because I still have a ton of fuel, and I figured I should be able to get all the way to Minmus, and that's going to be the second target moon. Now, Minmus also has a lot less gravity than the moon, so I figured that I should burn very little fuel actually getting there. So with the flag planted now, you can see I'm starting to burn away from the moon, and I'm actually going to completely escape here. Now, I targeted myself slightly incorrectly at first, so I had to move more towards Kerbin, but once I had that fixed, after not too long, I finally escaped here, and with one maneuver node, I ended up getting this nice encounter with Minmus here. Now, I ended up giving up on my burn a little bit early here, and this put me 3,000 meters above the surface. I figured this should be okay, and with that all planned out, next thing I wanted to do is warp towards Minmus, and with that done, it's time to go for the landing. Now, Minmus actually does have really flat areas to land on, but unfortunately, my path does not cover by any of them, so I'm gonna just have to hope for the best here. And I did realize a small problem. As I was coming in, I was a lot closer to the surface than I was expecting. It was actually so much so, in fact, that I ended up kind of hitting the surface pretty hard here and sort of just disintegrating. So I extended out my landing gear this time, and I wanted to do a quick burn right before I hit into the surface and hopefully save myself. Now I also boosted the brightness here to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see, but unfortunately this landing kind of just had to happen at night. You can see now falling in a bit closer here, and I found a cool rock in the background. Definitely wanted to check that out in a bit, but first I did actually need to stick this landing, and you can see now getting near the surface, I finally touched down here and actually get it. And with all that done, it was time to EVA my Kerbal, and with that done, I ended up using my jetpack to get over to this rock. Now, it turned out to literally just be a rock, but at the very least, it's a cool rock. So what I wanted to do is put down my flag in front of it, and with that done, it was time to get back into the rocket and burn towards the main ship again. Now, of course, coming off of Minmus here, this is my second of the 9 moons I need to get on, and this is all of the ones in the Kerbal system. So with this done, the next step is gonna be to get to Jool. Now, I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but first here you can see I'm pulling in my orbits, and I'm trying to rendezvous the 2 ships. This was a bit harder than I was expecting, but once I pulled in the orbit of the small ship, it was time to expand out the orbit of the mothership. This fortunately didn't take too long because the orbits were already pretty spread out, and you can see here I actually got that orbit fully extended out, and with that done, it was time to dock these. Now I'm skipping over this a little bit here because it really wasn't that interesting, but once I got them near each other, I had a little bit of trouble docking them. After a few tries though, I did get them connected together here, and it was time to set my target as Jool. Now the reason I wanted to go towards Jool next is it has 5 of the remaining 7 moons. The other thing is that 2 of these moons are going to be really hard to land on, so if I can finish up Jool, it should be pretty easy from that point on. So So you can see now extending out my orbit, and I finally escaped Kerbin. With that done, it took an unreal amount of time to get towards Jool. In fact, it took so long, this footage at 512 times speed. I ended up giving up halfway through this footage and ended up doing this overnight. Eventually, I did get all the way out to Jool's orbit and actually push a little bit past it, but fortunately, I still was able to get an encounter here and pull myself in. Now, I specifically planned this orbit so I'd be right above Jool's atmosphere. It's right about 200,000 meters here, and it was time to actually warp towards it. I did realize a small issue though. As I got closer, I was getting really close to Jool. Kinda too close, and my orbit was actually falling much further in than 200,000 meters. This causes problems because hitting the atmosphere at about 10 kilometers per second is usually a really bad thing. So I actually had to revert the flight here and check everything over again. This time I could see that the orbit was set to 320,000 meters, and warping towards Jool again, I checked and it was already down to 258. I really don't know why the orbit is changing on me, but at the very least, this should be above the atmosphere, and it's time to finally get captured. Now, I'm using my ion engines here to get captured, and I realized there's a problem. It's very slow. Now, part of the issue is actually that I'm only using a very small number of the engines, and this is because the solar panels are way less efficient this far out from the sun. Now, if the ion engines weren't going to be able to do it though, I did have an idea. What I could do is actually turn the ship completely around, and I could use the engine on the lander to hopefully push the whole thing into orbit. Obviously, this isn't ideal, and you can see I have the engines actually fighting each other here, but the liquid fuel engine should be way more powerful anyway, so really this is negligible. There was a problem with stability though, and I realized that this thing really liked to flip around, and I actually had to move my control point in order to get this to work. Giving it another try here though, I started to burn out here, and I finally managed to get captured. Now, with that capture done, the first target I wanted to get to is actually Lathe. That was the one that I showed off earlier. The reason for this is that Lathe is pretty close to Jool, and also I figured it was going to be really annoying, so I kind of just wanted to get it out of the way. Now, since Lathe has an atmosphere, I also decided to close off the docking port to make things slightly more aerodynamic, and with that done, you can see I burned a bit here to get my encounter. After a little bit more tuning, I got my periapsis down to about 30,000 meters, and I figured this should be good. That actually dips slightly into the atmosphere and should allow me to aerobrake a little bit. Unfortunately though, I hit the atmosphere a little fast, and this causes some problems. So I gave this another try, and this time I positioned myself to be slightly above the atmosphere. Now I started to do my retrograde burn here, and you can see after not too long, I did get captured. I used half of my fuel for this though, which was kind of a lot. Fortunately though, I should need very little actual fuel to land, since most of my speed loss is just going to be due to the atmosphere. Now I actually did dip into the atmosphere now, so I was going a bit slower, and I started to slow down a lot. I may have been a little aggressive though, because as I was falling down, something did explode off, and I couldn't really identify what it was. Judging by the position, I wasn't super worried about it, but it was something that I was trying not to replicate. And just one more of these passes, I actually did fall into the atmosphere here, and next, it was time to fall onto the land. Now, things started looking really good here, because there's a lot of land in front of me, so I was hoping I was actually going to be landing on land where I could mine and get some extra fuel. Now, as I was falling down here, I boosted the brightness for you guys, because it's a little hard to see what's going on, and at this height too, it became apparent I was gonna have to land in this weird ring structure. That was kind of unfortunate because it's really thin, and I was kind of worried I wasn't gonna be able to stick it, but I was hoping for the best here, and once I got a lot closer to it, I did a minor burn just to kill a little bit of speed. Now there's some extreme eyeballing going on because I had absolutely no idea what to do, but once my parachutes ended up deploying, I was kind of hoping for the best, and I could see here I was mostly going over the land. Now it also seemed like I was gonna be near the shoreline, which was actually a good thing because that means it's gonna be pretty flat. And after a little while longer, you can see here the main parachutes ended up deploying, and with that, it was pretty much guaranteed I was gonna be landing on the shore. That was really good because I was worried it was gonna take about 1,000 attempts to finally land on the land here, but you can see here I ended up going near the shore, and it actually was really flat. This was awesome, and once I got on the surface here, I ended up deploying my drills and starting to mine. Now, this is the first time I'm doing this here, and I also noticed now I ended up exploding off a solar panel. That's not a super big deal since I did have the extra power source, but it is gonna make things slightly asymmetric, so I was hoping that wasn't gonna be a big deal. Now, you can see my fuel slowly tick up here, and after about 1 trillion years, I eventually did manage to fill up the tanks, and I was ready to take off again. Before that, though, I did need to plant another flag, and it was at this point I was really glad that my capsule contained an infinite number of flags, so with this one planted, it was time to get back in the ship and take off. It still wasn't a guarantee if I was getting into orbit. Now, it was at this point I also realized I don't have fins. While I did add these before, I guess I accidentally unadded them at some point, and that was gonna make things a lot harder when getting into orbit here. So I ended up giving this another try now, and I was hoping to keep myself pretty stable. The plan on this launch was actually to be a lot higher than I needed to be, and that was to get me out of the atmosphere where it was gonna randomly turn me around. Unfortunately though, I ended up going way higher than I needed, and this actually caused me to have a lot of extra drag, and unfortunately I ended up spinning out here and losing a lot of energy. So I gave it one more try here, and this time I was going for a lot more shallow descent, and I was hoping to keep the engine always on, but at a really low power level just to keep myself stabilized until I got out of the atmosphere. And I could see putting it at a really low throttle level did keep me stabilized, and once I was about 40,000 meters, I could turn it off entirely, and the reaction wheels were good enough to keep myself straight. And finally here at the top of this trajectory, I continued my burn here, and I was really hoping to circularize. Again, I really wasn't sure if it was going to be a guarantee if I could get it, but fortunately here, I did get that periapsis, and with that, I had a stable orbit. Now, unfortunately though, I only have about 100 meters per second of delta V left, which is not enough to get to any planet. Now, I also didn't really want to move the mothership over, since that was going to be kind of a pain, so instead here, I actually wanted to launch a refueler ship and meet up with this one in orbit, and ended up launching away here, escaping from Kerbin, getting around Jool, and getting that encounter with Lathe. And after not too long, I ended up getting these to rendezvous, and with a little bit of burning, I got them to connect together, and ended up transferring the fuel in. Now, not only could I refuel a ship once, but I actually have enough fuel I could refuel it twice, so I figured I might as well keep this thing in orbit, and I could come back to it later if I need it. After that's done though, I ended up decoupling these ships, and I started to burn away, and my next target was gonna be Tylo. Now, Tylo's definitely gonna be the hardest moon to land on, because it has the same gravity as Lathe, but it has no atmosphere, so I have to kill all of that speed through fuel. And you can see here, I ended up fully escaping Lathe, and after that I pushed it a bit further to match up with Tylo. The problem though is at this point I only had about 3,000 meters per second of fuel left, and that just wasn't a lot. I really didn't think this was going to be enough, so instead I actually wanted to divert slightly, and instead of going to Tylo, I wanted to go to Val. Now Val is a lot less massive, it's actually closer, so this should be a little bit easier to get to. And you can see now I ended up planning my encounter to actually crash right into Val, because I figured I should be able to handle that, and with that done, it was time to warp in here and face the right direction. This was a really standard landing procedure, and in fact, this was probably my easiest landing of all of the moons. So once I started warping further down here, you can see I actually got near the surface, but I realized something interesting in the distance. There's these weird white plumes everywhere, and I was wondering what I was looking at. But before I investigated, I did have to finish this landing here, and once I was on the surface, I ended up EVAing my Kerbal and started to head over to one of these weird things. Now, after a while, you can actually see I stopped using the jetpack, and I started to walk, and this was mainly because I was worried about running out of fuel. But as I got a lot closer to this, it appeared to be some sort of geyser-like thing. So once I got there, I ended up climbing into it because why not? After getting right on the top of it, I ended up falling in it. Now, fortunately, it seemed to be perfectly fine in here, and it seemed like a really good place to plant my flag. And of course, with this planted, that is the 4th of the 9 moons I'm going to need. And now to get to Tylo, I knew I was gonna need to refuel completely here. So with a full tank now, I ended up coming off the surface, and I started to turn towards Jool. Now, I kind of misjudged how massive Val was, and once I finally got my orbit and escape, I had less fuel than I did before. You'll realize I only have about 2,300 meters per second of delta V, but I'm actually already going 2,600 meters per second. This means that, best case scenario, I'm going to be going 300 meters per second when I hit the surface. That isn't really gonna work, and what I actually was gonna need to do instead here was divert slightly and go towards Pole. Now, Pole is a much smaller moon, way farther out here, but it has really low gravity, which means that I should have a lot more fuel once I get to Tylo. Now, you'll notice Pole has a really uneven surface, and that largely has to do with its very low gravity. Now, I was really struggling to find a flat patch of land, but it seemed like if I cleared these mountains right over the edge, it seemed to be kinda flat. Unfortunately though, kinda flat still was pretty sloped here, and I wasn't really able to land properly. Now in my second attempt here, it still wasn't flat, but it was good enough that I was able to land, and after that, I started to completely refuel. And of course, after finishing that up, I have to plant my flag here. So with that done, that is the 5th moon, and it's time to head over towards Tylo. Now escaping Pole took almost no work at all. It was very easy here, and I managed to pull all the way away. And you can see now warping away from Pole, and I'm pulling in my orbit now to get near Tylo. Now, the first thing I'm doing here is not trying to land on Tylo. I just wanted to get a simple encounter here to limit my speed a little bit. And you can see now going for a pretty close scrape here. It was time to warp over towards Tylo and get this maneuver going. Now, right at the periapsis here, I wanted to check out my stats, and you can see that I was going 2,900 meters per second, but I only had 3,200 meters per second of delta V. Considering that there's still more distance that I'm going to be falling in towards Tylo, I knew that this was going to be really close. After a few more orbits though, I did manage to get my encounter here, and now I'm actually planning to fully land. You'll see I'm pulling in the periapsis to be only 1,000 meters above the surface, and I need to do this to get this done as efficiently as possible. This is going to be the hardest landing I've ever attempted here, and I see warping towards Tylo. I ended up actually warping a lot closer here, and I am really close to the surface already. Now, right around 7,500 meters from the ground, I ended up starting to do my burn here, and I was kind of just hoping for the best. I really didn't know what to expect here, but unfortunately, I didn't kill my speed fast enough, and at about 1,200 meters per second, I kind of just slammed it into the surface. So I gave it another try here at 1 minute and 8 seconds for the periapsis, and started to do my burn. That time was actually going to be how I was gauging everything, and while this was a lot better, I still hit the surface at 600 meters per second, which was probably really bad. So giving it another try here at 1 minute and 30 seconds, I wanted to see if this was going to be the right time. Now, this attempt was a lot different because I was killing my speed much faster, and while the surface was getting ever closer, I did manage to get down to a slow enough speed that I was almost completely stopped. Now, I fell into the surface more, but the issue was I ended up running out of fuel, and I still had about 100 meters per second left to go. So while this time I actually did survive, my rocket was kind of just wrecked, and I was gonna need to preserve it if I wanted to get off Tylo. So at 1 minute and 16 seconds, I tried this burn again here, and I was hoping this time I'd be at 0 meters per second the moment I touched the surface. And this attempt seemed a lot more promising. As I got near the surface, I was killing my speed quite quickly here, but I still didn't have that much delta V, and I wasn't really sure if there was enough fuel left to even finish this landing. So with one last burst, I got myself down to about 30 meters per second, and fortunately that seemed to be just slow enough that I managed to actually not break anything. I genuinely didn't know if I was going to do this without a refueler ship, but fortunately here I did actually stick it. After dropping a quick save here, I put down my flag and I started to do some mining. This took a really long time once again, but once I was fully fueled up here, it was time to get off the surface and go for a stable orbit. Now, getting an orbit here actually shouldn't be nearly as hard as getting off the planet, but escaping Tylo was a little worrying to me. Now, I got quite a bit closer to this mountain than I wanted to, but fortunately after that, just kept myself burning up a little bit, and pretty easily here, I got a full orbit. And with that completed, I actually had 1,300 meters per second of fuel left, and I thought that was gonna be plenty to get towards Lathe. I probably didn't even need to do this, but it was just a nice thing to do, just in case I needed to fuel when getting to the mothership. Now, after planning that encounter here, you see I ended up warping in, and it was time to meet up with that ship. Now, I'll save you all the boring details of me trying to get these two ships right next to each other, but once I did that here, you see I ended up carefully guiding them right into place, and they ended up docking. And after a quick fuel transfer here, it was time to undock and get towards the mothership. Now, fortunately, my orbit here was already really close to the edge, and with a little bit more, met up with the mothership here, and you see I tried docking. This one wasn't as clean as before because the angles were slightly off, but the second bounce here ended up touching, and with that, I once again had an insane amount of lag. Now, it was also time to extend out my orbit again, and I wanted to get towards Lathe. Hopefully, an encounter there would fling me out a lot further, and with the second encounter off Tylo, I should be able to get all the way out towards Bop, the last moon in the Jool system that I need to visit. And it took an absolutely unbelievably long time, but eventually I did manage to get that encounter set up here, and with that done, I flung away from Lathe, and I set up another one with Tylo. Now, this one really pulled out my orbit a lot, and once I had that set up, I warped over towards Tylo, and I completed that encounter. And once that was done, I ended up undocking my lander ship, and it was time to meet up with Bop. Now, Bop is kind of annoying because it's inclined pretty far up from the other planets, which means that meeting up with it takes a lot more fuel than you'll expect. Now, Bop is really light though, so it shouldn't be that hard to land on. I can see now warping towards it, it was time to go for that landing. Now, unfortunately, I was landing at night because I didn't think anything through here, but I will be boosting the brightness for you guys, and keep in mind that I really couldn't see anything nearly as well as this. Now, after killing my speed here, it was time to start going towards the surface and hoping I'd be on a flat area. Bop is very irregular, but it's not quite as bad as Pole in my opinion. So after not too long, I did get near the surface, and while I wasn't on a flat area, it was good enough that I wasn't sliding, and I was able to start mining. And you can see now with my rocket kind of sliding in the background, I did put down the flag, and after planting this flag, this is all of the moons in the Jool system. Now, I do have 2 moons still left to land on here, so you can see I'm taking off here, and I'm meeting up with the main ship again. Now, the remaining 2 moons are Ike and Gilly. Ike orbits Duna, and Gilly orbits Eve. Now, I used a quick gravity assist off Tylo to fling myself out of the Jool system, and with that done, it's time to get my encounter with Duna. Now, I wanted to go to Ike first, mainly because it's physically closer, and it took an unreal amount of time for my ion engines to pull in my orbit all the way to Duna. And with that set up here, I ended up decoupling my lander ship, and my plan was to use just this for the rest of the challenge. Now, I ended up setting up a quick maneuver node here to get myself right around Duna, and you can see now warping in really close here, and I ended up circularizing and pulling in my orbit just before Ike. Now, I'll save you some of the details here, but you can see me going in for this landing, and similarly to before, my rocket is somewhat sliding, getting, and after some mining, I ended up taking off here and going for an Eve encounter. This was pretty easy to get set up here, and once I had that, I ended up setting up an encounter with Gilly. Now, Gilly is the latest moon here, and all I need to do is pretty much just crash straight into it, and I should be fine. I was going a lot faster than I was expecting, though, but after not too long, did manage to kill some speed, and I was being really careful not to overdo it, because if I did, it was gonna take forever for Gilly to pull me back down. But you can see now, I ended up sticking the landing, and the surface was really uneven, but fortunately, didn't even matter since Gilly's so late. And at that done, I ended up flying over to another cool rock and planting the last flag. So guys, thanks for watching. This video was an absolute marathon to make, and even just editing it was kind of a pain. I was actually really happy with how it all came out, and in the future, I definitely want to try doing an all the planets and moons challenge. So if you want to see that, make sure to let me know down in the comments below. Be sure to like the video if you like the challenge, and otherwise, till next time.